With the recent discoveries that the writer of Harry Potter is an unrepentant transphobe, I think that, instead of just trying to cancel J.R. Rowling something. Look, you know what? If she won't bother to learn my name because it's not my birth name because she's a transphobic bigot, then I feel no desire to even Google what her actual name is. Fuck her. She's not getting a platform here. I don't even feel like mentioning her by name. So, you know who the Harry Potter author is. If you still want to read the Harry Potter books, by the way, go to a library. Because fuck giving her any of your money. But instead of just staging a boycott, which honestly might get the right wing so fascinated in Harry Potter that it really counterbalances our efforts quite a bit, I don't know, see Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day, or, in reverse, see the Nike boycott, or really any of the recent politically charged boycotts in this or many other countries. I think that what we should do is start celebrating and actively looking for people who are trans folk, who are writers. People who are writers who are non-TERF feminists or trans-inclusive feminists, if we really have to make that a term. That should just be implied in feminist, right? Anyways, I happen to be trans and a feminist, so fuck it, let's talk about my writing. So some of you may know that I became a content creator out of a desire to eat, but also make a living as a writer. What some of you may not know is that over the last 2 or 3 years, I've written about 10 books. And only 8 of those are available online, and I'm going to talk about all of them in this video, so hey, lots of self-promotion, but please stick around. One thing that I like to do in writing, one thing that makes me think that my writing is good for this topic, is that I try to be conscious of providing representation to people who are unrepresented. This is also what I do with this channel. I feel like the actual left is largely unrepresented in the media, so here I am trying to do my best to represent the actual left in a non-stupid poll kind of way. So, speaking of representation, this brings me into my first book. I'm going to do the standalone books first, and then we're going to get into the big series. The first book I want to talk about is largely about representation. It's called The Four Faces of Finn. So our main character here, Finn, is a content creator who does video reviews of queer-centric fiction, especially superhero fiction, comic books and the like, because deep down, Finn really wants to be a superhero someday. Now, unfortunately, Finn's only real superpower happens to be mental illness. Specifically, Finn has dissociative identity disorder. Finn has 3 alters: Faro, Syra, and Hikaru. And they're in a fairly harmonious relationship, and even though a lot of the book sees Finn by himself, he's never alone, as you'll come to see as you read the book. In addition just to the queer representation, which comes through in Finn, the subject matter that he covers in his work, it also represents us independently employed content creators. It also represents the queer community in his relationship with a non-binary trans person, and the unique struggles of queer relationships, as well as the unique struggles of queers trying to interact in the professional world, or just interact in the world at all. The next book is called Blaze of Glory. So this was originally supposed to be a choose-your-own-adventure style video game that I was contracted to write for a video game developer, but the developer promptly stopped messaging me like 2 days into the project when I was like 40 pages deep in a script. So instead of completely scrapping the idea, I decided to let it run through its first act because, it was going to branch significantly at Act 1. It already branches a lot within the story, and I ended up kind of boiling it down to the most cohesive and entertaining storyline for the book. but it was going to branch 2 ways in Act 2 and 3 ways from each of those for 6 total story paths and endings. And, essentially that is the effort of writing a trilogy. And I wasn't down for it, so I decided to just turn it into a novella. The story focuses around a man who finds himself in a post-apocalyptic world 500 years in our future. The unfortunate backstory of this world is that instead of giving a damn about global warming, the wealthy elites of this planet decided to build a space force and just, pack up their shit and go to outer space and try to find a new planet to wreck. They left most of the population of Earth to deal with the hardest parts of global warming, and at the point where the story takes place, there's maybe less than 1% of humanity left surviving, and we're left in a pretty horrible state. But in addition to that, our biggest problem in some ways is the fact that the rich people came back at a certain point, and they had done a lot of genetic engineering in order to keep themselves viable while they were floating around in outer space with limited access to resources. Now, the modified human beings, or potentially transhumans, that came back to the planet are basically zombies, like future zombies. But honestly, these aren't the biggest problem that the world faces, as our main character finds out after they leave the Deadlands, which is one of Earth's many huge desolate deserts, and find themselves in a human colony known as Oasis. Upon finding themselves in Oasis, they begin to realize that with all the horrible things that human culture has been through over the last couple hundred years, maybe they were better off alone to begin with. Now, for the other 6 books that I'm going to talk about, they're all part of a giant fantasy saga, or kind of a science fiction fantasy saga, depending on how you want to look at it and which trilogy you're going through and what perspective that particular trilogy has. So it's actually a series of at least 8 books, with 1 prequel, 1 post-saga story, and 2 parallel trilogies right there in the center. The trilogies, I'm going to refer to them as the Mindscape Trilogy and the Multiverse Trilogy. So in the Mindscape Trilogy, and I'm going to start with the prequel, because a lot of this stuff gets rehashed at the very beginning of Book 1, which is called Dark Memories. So in what was at the time near future, it's actually now the recent past, a Japanese video game company that is famous for developing a virtual reality system which is able to directly interface with a person's brain in order to stimulate all of their senses and give them the most immersive virtual reality experience, is branching off into a new product where for each individual user a world is created in their mind that is based on their own subconscious, giving each individual user their own unique video game experience. So for the beta test of this, they called in a graphic designer named Danny from America, and basically put them through the beta test, which doesn't really have any colors or textures yet. Instead, they are just finding things and giving them colors and textures, and as they do this, the headset is learning where the human mind keeps our creative faculties and where we store the kind of data that it needs to populate the world. And over the course of this, the problem comes when the internal failsafes start to really go awry. But I'm not going to get too farther into that because that's all in the prequel book. But let's start with Dark Memories. So Dark Memories takes place after the beta test. Aiko, the chief programmer, is experimenting with a modified version of the Mindscape platform, or the Mindscape headset, I guess. And this one is able to create neural feedback and also to kind of program the mind a little bit, coax it to regenerate in a certain way. And she plans to use this to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. But to do that, they have to perform a little bit of an experiment, a little bit under the table, with a businessman's daughter who has recently lost the ability to speak. So they dive into her subconscious, which creates its own world. And inside of that, her consciousness can speak. But she also gets kidnapped pretty much right away by an evil emperor who looks exactly like her father. So that part of the story focuses on, getting to the emperor's palace and reclaiming the stolen princess. because they believe that if they can rescue her consciousness from her own, like, internal mind prison, that they can bring her voice back. The other half of the story focuses on Koji, who is the owner of the company that is, doing all of this stuff. And Koji has realized after the beta test that it's really not possible for them to roll this out in the way that he originally planned, because it would take up an incredible amount of data to let millions of users, should this game become popular, each create their own world on his server. I mean, it's just entirely impractical. So instead, he's diving into his own mind to try to create a world and, like, record it and basically use it as a video game generation platform. Now, his world is mainly focused on his internalization of his failures as a boss, as a person, as a human being. At the end of the book, there is a rather abrupt twist which feeds into the next book, which is called the Prometheus Effect. Now, there was a character that's running through these books called Shade. Shade is a digital life form that was born within the multiverse, within the Mindscapes. And Shade is kind of a helpful partner throughout Dark Memories. But because of the events of the ending of Dark Memories, Shade, who is in the body of an 8-year-old child, even though their consciousness isn't exactly childlike, decides that the only way that they will be able to continue to help their friends and allies is to rapidly age themselves. And the way that they go about doing this is to enter a world where time moves at 1,000 times the scale of the real world, allowing them to age from 8 years old into a 20-something literally overnight. This story introduces the world Tartarus, which is honestly my favorite of any of the worlds in the multiverse. It's the one I revisit the most. And it's kind of a standard fantasy coming-of-age story in a lot of ways, except that it kind of has this sci-fi framing that's really interesting, and it's a mishmash of all sorts of, like, mythologies and stuff that I find really fascinating. Like, there's a lot of Gnosticism involved in it, and kind of Roman lore, Greek lore. I try to make it pretty diverse because, I imagine people have heard all of these different mythologies, and when we try to create a world inside of our heads, we probably assemble it from all of these little snippets of mythologies that we've heard. At least that's how I go about writing things, and that's how a lot of fantasy stories are written. So I figured that would be appropriate. Now, this particular book runs parallel to the first book of the other series, in which they're performing a different type of beta test. They bring in an American gamer to beta test Koji's new idea of this Mindscape Worlds project, taking people and putting them into these worlds that have been created instead of allowing their mind to create their own world. And inside of this world, the gamer meets a cast of heroes from all across the multiverse, and they are all guided by the goddess Athena. Now, Athena assigns them the mission of, eventually becoming skilled enough to be able to take on the gods themselves. And as a part of this training, in order to reach that end, she assigns them a world to save. Now, the world isn't necessarily in the same type of danger that you usually see in fantasy stories. It's really more of a political issue, or a series of political issues. Basically, the world is just in a sort of political disarray, and they come in to try to solve the issues that world has. And this story was actually based on a tabletop game that I made while I was writing the Prometheus Effect, and invited my friends to play. It was completely custom. I made up the magic and everything to suit the world in the way that I wanted people to play and interact with that world, which was a really fun idea. And honestly, this is my favorite book out of the whole series, because I think that in some ways it is the most true. The characters are the best developed because they're based on real people and how real people reacted to the world that I had created. The next 3 books, the next book in the Mindscape series and the next 2 books in the Multiverse series, all happen within the same time frame, with the second and third book of the Multiverse series taking place approximately in the first and second half of the third book of the Mindscape series. And I really cannot get into the plot of any of those books very effectively without just a lot of spoilers. So I'm just not going to do it. You just have to know that they're good. You know, if you've gotten to that point in either trilogy, you know, have fun. But they largely overlap. There's a lot of scenes that are in both books, but told from completely different perspectives. So they really enrich each other as parallel stories. The same is true of Athena's Chosen, the first book of the the first book of the Multiverse series, and the Prometheus Effect, the second book of the Mindscape series. There's a lot of things that seem kind of side questy when you read them individually, but they kind of piece together to be a story that isn't told really in either book, but is told in both of those books together. The final book in this, which is the only one that I haven't finished, is, it doesn't even really have a title yet. My working title is Damsels. It's essentially an attempt to take a lot of the female characters that I developed over the course of the saga and to give them a new story and a new adventure to explore. It takes place in Tartarus because, as I said before, that is my favorite of any of the worlds that I created for this series, and specifically takes place in the city of Delphi, which is kind of, or the kingdom of Delphi, which is kind of like the de facto capital of Tartarus. Now, through the course of the saga, Delphi goes from being initially very patriarchal to a little bit more modern, but really the story of Damsels is about these women coming together in order to dismantle the remainder of the patriarchy, and it's really meant to mirror the last 50 or 60 years of feminism and how it has evolved in our world, and kind of run parallel to that theoretically. You know, even coming full circle, talking about TERFs. Like, TERFs totally fucking exist. And there are totally trans characters in the saga, and I get a little bit more into that in Damsels than I do in the rest of the saga, but there you go. And the way that essentially the metaphor works in that book is that for the longest time, Delphian customs prevented women from being able to learn magic. But it also prevented the poor from being able to learn magic. There's an element of also class struggle in here as well. So it was essentially only like the royalty, the nobility, and the knights that ever were really encouraged to learn magic, or the army as well. But only really in those cases in offensive capabilities. Oh yeah, also the priests too, but they learn kind of their own special type of magic, and also the Delphian priesthood is exclusively male, so that really doesn't help women at all. So essentially the core story of Damsels is these women coming together to empower other women through knowledge and magic. So if you're one of those people who doesn't want to give me money on Patreon for making these videos, but you would be interested in supporting me as a creator, you can totally go buy my books. Unfortunately, the best deal that I could get as an independent writer without trying to put a lot of effort and money into getting a publisher was to do it through the Amazon marketplace. I feel kind of shitty supporting Jeff Bezos in that way, but honestly, Amazon gives me the biggest cut of the book profits of any platform, so I kind of bit the bullet on that. And also, even the shorter books are going to be at least $2.99, because if they're less than $2.99, I only get 30% of the profits, as opposed to 70% of the profits if I sell them for $2.99 or more. But even the novellas that I mentioned here are at least 100 pages, so you do get a good amount of bang for your buck. So that is definitely a way to support me as a creator if you want to get something in return other than just internet videos, as I usually give my patrons. Even if you don't want to purchase my content, even if none of that sounded appealing to you, I do encourage you to look for trans and queer and feminist creators out there, feminist writers, trans writers, and support them. because honestly, all artists are struggling. And with us being in late stage capitalism, with people having very little disposable income, we are all collectively struggling as artists, but the marginalized among us are struggling the most. And honestly, it can be really hard to self-publicize if you are a part of a marginalized community, because you're essentially opening yourself up to a lot of hate. Because the more renown that any individual trans person gets, the more TERFs, the more jackasses, the more bigots are going to come out of the woodworks to try to tear us down out of jealousy. Even more jealousy than your typical artist tends to get. So, please, find a trans creator and support them today, even if it's not me. Because it is important. We're trying to live here in this unjust system just as much as you are. But, in any case, thanks for watching.